Hello everyone, and today I'd like to give you a few pointers on focusing to improve your macro photography. Stay tuned. I apologize in advance because I'm pretty tired today. I just got off of a really nice hike yesterday. They finally started reopening some of the trails, and I went on the Lob Lolly Trail at Umstead Park in North Carolina. And it's not a long trail. It's like 7 miles round trip. It's a down and back trail. But like I said, it's about 7 miles. But I've been stuck inside for so long. I really think I'm starting to atrophy. My muscles are starting to atrophy. My muscles are dying. And so I had a lot of trouble out there getting back into the groove of things. You know, I love hiking. I love walking, but I struggled a little bit. But anyway, I got a really nice image while I was out there. That as you cross over a creek going down into onto the second half of the trail, there's a little creek with some large rocks, and I got a really nice image that I'll put up on the screen. But the reason I'm bringing that up though is because that plays into our macro photography focusing. So one of the things I had to do in order to get that shot is I had to focus stack that. You know, there's a large rock in the foreground, and then there's a second cropping of rocks where the water's coming through a small opening between two rocks. And because I wanted to shoot at a wide aperture, because I wanted the background to be nice and soft and have a nice glowy look, I had to focus stack. Otherwise, I could only have either the rock in the front or the rock in the midground in focus. So that's what I did. I ended up doing a total of 3 images. The rock in the foreground is one image. The separation between the 2 rocks in the midground is another image, and then the actual water came from a 3rd image. Because I wanted a long enough shutter speed to glass the water in the foreground, but the water coming through the rocks, I still wanted to have texture. So I did another image that I did a luminosity mask with, that I painted in over top to give the water that texture again. And it came out really nice, but it was only possible because I was able to focus stack that image. So you know, that's part of the reason I want to make this video, is because I feel like with photography, focus is so important. It's so underappreciated. What is in focus is just as important as what is in the image. So you know, there again, like with that image, if the background is sharp, it loses all of the interest in that image. So I want to talk to you a little bit about focusing and how it relates to macro photography. So we're going to do a couple of images, and then I'll tell you some of my tricks and what I like to do. So the first image, let's assume that you've got your macro lens and you've got it on your camera and you've got it set up with something interesting in the foreground. So I'm going to shoot this at f5.6, and we'll take a quick shot and see how it looks. So what we're going to end up with is a reasonably sharp center, which is where we put our focus point. And the edges are going to be out of focus. Now, part of that is due to the depth of field. So with macro photography, it's recommended most of the time that you're going to use a fairly deep depth of field. So you're going to use an aperture between probably on the low side f8 up to f32, depending on what you're shooting and how much aperture you need. You want to be careful because you start to run into diffraction as you go higher. But let's bring this out to f14 and do a shot at f14 and see if that fixes our problem. Well, looking at it, I can clearly see that we are sharper than we were, but it's definitely not right. And a big part of that is because our subject is actually angling away from the camera. It's really important when you're doing macro photography, especially, but any kind of photography where you need a fairly reasonable depth of field that needs to be consistent over your entire image. It's really important. You have to understand that your depth of field is going to act like a flat plane. So like if we take something flat like this and put it against the lens and then move that outward, that's how your depth of field is going to act. So if this is angling away from our camera, there's no reasonable way, without having unreasonable depth of field, that we're going to be able to get sharpness from the beginning to the end. So what we need to do is we need to angle our subject, and not drop it ideally, we need to angle our subject so that it is as level with our camera as we can get it. Refocus and take another shot. And of course, our framing has changed, but our subject is in much better focus now. So now let's try a different camera position that will give us a better and more interesting image. It's important to remember that your subject matter needs to be perpendicular to the surface of the lens, if at all possible. Now, that's not the case if your intention is not to have your entire subject in focus. For example, if you only want to have the very tip of this in focus, like that, then obviously you wouldn't want to have it perpendicular for the same reason. So we would be able to scoot this assembly closer. Now that leads me into my next tip for you, and that is to pick up some sort of slide. This is a Really Right Stuff mpr-cl. This is a small slide intended for panoramic use. You see, what I would do with it is first rotate my clamp so we can mount the camera and the slide. Now we're going to mount the camera to the slide, and what that's going to allow us to do is slide the camera while leaving the tripod in place. See? And that's because we've got it attached on a slide, just like that, to the tripod. So that allows us to find the exact point that we want. So we can set our lens at, for example, 1:1, and then just slide the camera in until the very tip of our subject is in focus, which is much easier than trying to scoot your entire tripod setup forward or backwards. You can get these rails from third-party manufacturers very, very cheaply. There's tons and tons of companies that make them. You want to look up a nodal rail, and I'll put the spelling for that up on the screen. Now, another one of the techniques that I'd like to mention is this little guy right here. See, I love this little guy right here. This is actually made by Nikon, but there's tons and tons of manufacturers that have similar products. But what this does is it's a little miniature clamp that you can clamp to various things, and it allows you to hold on to something, whatever your subject matter may be, you know, like so. It's really easy, so it'll hold something in a very specific position very easily. You can use this to, I mean, this isn't the ideal solution for it, but you could use it to hold a light if you needed to. Just like that. See, I'll frequently attach it to the tripod leg like this, and that way it can sit out in front of the camera and it'll hold something that I don't have other good means to do so. You know, now it's not the most stable thing in the world, so you know, some wind will move it around, but at least your subject will stay relatively close to where you want it to be. So this is another tip that I would highly recommend. You pick one of these up. You can get these for really cheap. So the next recommendation I'm going to make to you is a cable release. These are really, really handy. What this will do is allow you to get your camera to 1:1 or whatever magnification that you want, but not jar the camera when you push the shutter button, because you're going to push this and it's going to be totally insulated from the camera through the cable. So that'll allow you to get a nice, sharp image, especially of things that you don't want to be that close to, because you won't have to physically be that close. You can get quite a few feet away. So let's put that into practice with something and get a shot real quick. So here we have some cheap sparklers. These are just cheap, like dollar store sparklers. These are really, really cool subjects to photograph because they scratch a couple of itches that I have with macrophotography. In macrophotography, I like to photograph motion and I like contrast. So these are a really cool subject to learn on because they will create their own light, which allows you to artificially darken the background without bringing in extra lighting. But the other thing that's really cool is they'll show motion if you do long enough shutter speeds. So let's do a couple of photos with these using some of the techniques that I've showed you to see if we can get an interesting image. Okay, so what we have here is our camera on a macro slide, like I mentioned, well, a nodal slide, but a macro slide for our purposes, which has allowed me to get the exact right distance to our subject easily. We've got our subject dead even with our camera so that our plane of focus is perfectly flush against our subject. We've got our subject, which is our sparkler, mounted into our flexible arm, which is allowing us to mount it easily and not have to put our hands in the way. We're going to be using a remote trigger, which is going to allow me to keep my hands away from the sparkler so I don't get burned. And we're going to take a couple of shots and see what happens. So we're going to light our sparkler. Unfortunately, it looks like I burned my clamp just a little bit. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. Got a couple of interesting shots, it looks like, so far. I think we're going to be pretty happy with those. Cool. Now, the only tip that I haven't given you that I think is worth mentioning, I don't recommend shooting macro photography handheld for a couple of reasons, but the primary being that I don't believe that you are able to get sharp enough images. But if you are going to shoot handheld, one trick that I'd like to pass on to you is always shoot your images at a given reproduction ratio. So let's say you're going to shoot it 1:1 and you've got a subject that's walking across, say a rock or something like that. Move your body, not the focus. So don't manually focus don't autofocus the lens. Leave it where it is, and then move closer or further away as needed to get your subject in focus. It's really important that you don't bump your focus ring while you're shooting, because the correct spot is so small with macro photography. The correct focus point is so tiny with macro photography that most of the time you're going to either overshoot or undershoot that point. And your camera's going to make the same mistake. I can't tell you how many shots I've missed because the camera decided to miss focus, or it decided to rack all the way to infinity and back while I was trying to get a really interesting moment with a small insect. I learned a long time ago, move the camera, not the focus. That was by a wide margin one of the best tips that I ever picked up for handheld macro photography. But again, I would highly recommend that you do your macro photography from a tripod if it's possible. I highly recommend that because it gives you a lot more flexibility, and if you get used to doing that, it'll become easier as you progress. Anyway, thank you. This has been Focusing Tips and Techniques for Macro Photography. Hope you enjoyed, and have a good day. Thanks.